As Evelyn knelt at the trial stone, the cool marble beneath her felt as cold as the weight in her chest. The whispers of the crowd echoed in her ears, but they were nothing more than a dull hum compared to the pounding of her own heart. She had never expected to be here, at the center of the trial, alone, rejected. The other Omegas had already been claimed, their futures decided. But no one had stepped forward for her. She could feel their eyes on her, the judgment in the air, and the harsh whispers that followed her every move. Broken Omega, they called her, unworthy. The words cut deep, sharper than any blade, and yet, she remained still, trying to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. Her scent, the one that should have called a mate, never developed. To the wolves around her, she was invisible. Unwanted. A mistake. Evelyn lifted her gaze to the sky, to the full moon above. She was meant to be an Omega, a mate, a part of the pack, but she had failed. She had always known something was different about her, but the lack of a scent had sealed her fate. No Alpha would choose her. She felt a lump in her throat, the weight of the situation threatening to collapse her from within. Why am I even here, she thought bitterly. Suddenly, a soft voice broke through the silence, calling her name. Evelyn. She turned to find an unfamiliar figure standing at the edge of the temple. A man, tall and limping, his figure hunched as though each step caused him immense pain. His hair was dark, his face partially hidden behind a rough beard, but his eyes, those silver eyes. They gleamed in the dim candlelight, like a storm waiting to break. He stepped forward with a slow, deliberate pace, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His clothes were simple, nothing regal about him, yet there was something commanding about his presence. I apologize for the intrusion, he said, his voice low and rough. I was told I might find an Omega here, one who might be willing to consider an unusual arrangement. Evelyn blinked in confusion. The ceremony is over, she replied, trying to hide the bitterness in her voice. All the Omegas have been claimed. The man looked at her for a moment, then shrugged as if her words didn't matter. Not all, it seems, he said quietly. His gaze lingered on her, his eyes scanning her face, the unease in her stance. You're still here. His voice was strange, carrying a weight to it that she couldn't place. Perhaps you would consider an arrangement with me, he continued, his tone shifting. I need an Omega. And you need a way out of here. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine, but something in his gaze made her pause. What are you offering? She asked cautiously. He moved closer, wincing with each step. A marriage of convenience. I require someone to present as my mate. You, I imagine, have no desire to return home after the way you've been treated. This could be a solution for both of us. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding with each other. She didn't know him, didn't know what he wanted, but the weight of rejection in the air was unbearable. Why me? She asked, a little more forcefully than she meant. Why choose me? He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Because you are here, he said simply. And because I am in need of a wife who won't ask too many questions. His words were blunt, but they carried a strange honesty with them that caught her off guard. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the temple's open doors, the cold night air beckoning beyond. She had nowhere else to go. She could stay here, where everyone had already written her off, or she could take a chance on this strange man, the stranger who seemed as broken as she was. I accept, she heard herself say before she could think it through. The words fell from her lips before she could stop them, sealing a fate she wasn't sure she understood. The man's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his gaze, surprise, perhaps, or interest. Then we have an agreement, he said, offering her his hand. His palm was warm, but rough. As she took it, something jolted through her, a strange energy that ran from his touch into hers. It was brief, fleeting, but it left her heart racing. We leave at dawn, he said, his voice now a little softer. Prepare yourself. Evelyn nodded, still in a daze. She wasn't sure if she had made the right decision, but in that moment, it didn't seem to matter. The only thing that mattered was that she was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the broken Omega left to be forgotten. She was going somewhere. With him. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The sun had barely risen when Evelyn stood at the edge of the small cottage, looking out over the forest that stretched for miles. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, the kind of smell that only comes from untouched land. It was strange to think that just a few hours ago, she had been kneeling in the temple, rejected and invisible. Now, she was here, standing beside a man who had somehow claimed her fate. The wind stirred the branches of the trees, and she felt an unfamiliar sensation in her chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like the calm before a storm. The man who had taken her hand, who had made this strange arrangement, was still inside. He had insisted she rest while he prepared for their journey. But Evelyn knew she couldn't stay inside for long. She needed to clear her head, to figure out what she had just agreed to. She took a deep breath and turned to face the cottage. It was simple, but the stone walls and wooden beams spoke of a long history, one that felt both foreign and familiar to her. As she walked down the small path leading to the edge of the forest, she tried to push aside the questions that had been swirling in her mind. Who was this man, really? And why had he chosen her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find the man Tyr, he had said his name, was walking toward her. His limp was still pronounced, but there was a strength in his movements that belied his appearance. I thought you might want to know, he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something deeper. We'll be leaving soon. It's a long journey to Thornville, and it would be better if we leave before midday. Evelyn nodded, her heart racing. Thornville. The name was unfamiliar to her, but the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't help but wonder what awaited her there. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. Are you? Kyr's eyes flicked to her for a moment, his silver gaze intense, but he said nothing. He just nodded, and with a slight motion of his head, he turned and began walking back toward the cottage. Evelyn followed, her mind still racing. There were so many unanswered questions. What kind of life awaited her in Thornville? And what was it about this man, this stranger, that made her trust him even though everything in her told her not to? As they made their way back to the cottage, she noticed that the air had changed. There was a strange stillness to it, like the world itself was holding its breath. It made her uneasy, but she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The inside of the cottage was warm, and Evelyn could see that Kyr had already packed their things. There was a small bundle of clothes by the door, and a satchel that she assumed would hold her belongings. He had prepared everything without a word, as if it were all perfectly normal. Evelyn couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had agreed to this arrangement so quickly, without knowing anything about him or where they were going. She glanced at him, but his attention was on the satchel in his hands. We leave now, he said softly. There was something in his tone that made her stop. She wanted to ask him more questions, to learn more about the journey ahead, but the moment felt wrong for it. Instead, she simply nodded, silently gathering her things and preparing herself for whatever would come next. As they stepped out of the cottage, the world around them seemed even quieter. The only sound was the soft crunch of the earth beneath their feet as they walked toward the small cart that would carry them on their journey. Evelyn took one last look at the place she had just begun to call home. It was gone, just like everything else in her life. The future was uncertain, but at least she was no longer invisible. She was no longer the forgotten Omega. She was someone's wife now, though she didn't yet fully understand what that meant. Kyr helped her into the cart, and as she settled beside him, she glanced up at the sky. The sun was climbing higher now, casting its golden light over the world. It felt like the start of something new. But as the wheels of the cart creaked into motion, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than she could ever have imagined. The journey was longer than Evelyn had anticipated. The road ahead was rough, winding through thick forests and across rolling hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. The cart creaked and groaned with every bump in the road, the horses pulling it steadfastly forward, though the air had grown colder as they moved further into the wilderness. Evelyn sat quietly beside Kyr, the man who had become her strange companion on this unexpected journey. Despite the calm exterior he presented, there was an undeniable tension in the air, an unspoken weight that hung between them. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something neither of them could control. Keir had not spoken much since they left the cottage, his attention focused solely on the road ahead. His movements were careful, deliberate, though Evelyn could still see the signs of his injury, the way he leaned slightly to one side, the subtle wince every time the cart jolted. She wanted to ask him about it, to know more about the man who had pulled her into this world so suddenly, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself lost in her thoughts, thinking about her past, her life before this strange twist of fate. The pack she had grown up in, the family that had rejected her, the life she had always thought she would lead, none of it mattered now. Evelyn was far from the familiar woods of her youth. She was alone with a man who seemed both a stranger and a figure of immense power, someone she could neither trust nor fully understand. She stole a glance at him, trying to make sense of what he had said and what he hadn't. He was not what he seemed, that much was certain. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when he dropped the act of being the crippled man he had portrayed. His eyes, those striking silver eyes, would flash with something deep and intense, a power that seemed to radiate from him when he least expected it. Evelyn could feel it, like crackling energy in the air around them. She had heard rumors of powerful men, of alphas who hid their true identities, but she had never imagined being caught in one of their webs. What did Keir want with her? And why had he chosen her? The questions lingered, unanswered, as they continued their journey. The sky overhead was a muted gray, the clouds heavy with the promise of rain, and Evelyn could feel the tension in the air growing thicker. The cart moved forward, the sound of the wheels grinding against the dirt road mingling with the rustling of the trees. She felt a sudden wave of anxiety wash over her, the uncertainty of what lay ahead pressing in on her chest. She wanted to speak, to ask Keir about Thornville, about what awaited them there, but the words caught in her throat. What if he didn't answer? What if he told her something she wasn't ready to hear? Her silence seemed to draw him closer, though she couldn't say why. When she looked at him again, she noticed that his eyes had shifted to her. "You're nervous," he said, his voice soft but firm. It wasn't a question, more of a statement. She hesitated, then nodded. "I don't know what's going to happen." He seemed to consider this for a moment before responding. "None of us do. But it's better to face it head-on than to run from it." His words struck her, though she wasn't sure why. There was something in the way he spoke, a certain assurance, as if he had faced worse and come out stronger. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if this was part of the reason he had chosen her, to test her, to see if she was worthy of whatever was to come. She opened her mouth to ask him more, but the sudden sound of hooves approaching from behind silenced her. The cart slowed as the sound grew louder, and soon, another figure appeared on horseback, riding swiftly toward them. Evelyn tensed, her heart racing. She had no idea who this new arrival was, but she knew that something was about to change. The rider pulled up beside them, his horse snorting as it slowed. Evelyn's eyes widened as she recognized the figure, another man, tall and powerful, his eyes gleaming with the same intensity as Keir's, but there was something colder about him. The stranger's gaze flicked between Evelyn and Keir, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Well, he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What have we here?" Evelyn's stomach twisted in knots, the sense of foreboding deepening with every word. She glanced at Keir, searching for a reaction, but his face remained unreadable, as if he had been expecting this encounter. The stranger's eyes finally rested on her, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "Who is she?" the man asked, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of command. Evelyn swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as Keir stepped forward, blocking her from view. "She's with me," Keir replied, his voice calm but laced with something darker. The stranger's smile faltered, just for a moment, before it returned, wider than before. "Is that so?" he said, his tone mocking. "Well, then, I suppose I'll leave you to your little journey. But I wouldn't be so sure that it will go as planned." With that, he turned his horse and rode off, leaving Evelyn with more questions than answers. She looked up at Keir, trying to read him, but he was already turning back to the road. The tension between them was palpable, and Evelyn could feel it growing stronger with every mile they traveled. Whatever was waiting for them in Thornville, she was certain now that it was not going to be an easy journey. The silence between Evelyn and Keir stretched as the cart continued its slow journey. The encounter with the stranger had left her uneasy, though she couldn't fully explain why. She tried to push the feeling aside, focusing on the path ahead, but the man's words echoed in her mind. "I wouldn't be so sure that it will go as planned." What did that mean? And who was he, really? She glanced at Keir, but his face remained as unreadable as ever, his attention fixed ahead. Evelyn let out a soft sigh, unsure of what to say. She had never been so uncertain in her life. The world felt like it was shifting beneath her feet, and she had no idea where it would land. She wanted to ask Keir more questions, but the words caught in her throat. What was the truth about Thornville? What had she gotten herself into? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he had let on. The longer they traveled, the more she realized just how little she knew about the man who had brought her along. His true identity remained a mystery, and every time she tried to push past the surface, he closed himself off again. It was frustrating, but she couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him, as if there was something deeper, something more complex beneath his carefully crafted mask. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the air grew warmer. The forest around them started to thin out, and Evelyn could see distant hills on the horizon. The landscape was changing, and with it, the sense of unease she had carried with her seemed to shift. She wasn't sure if it was the view ahead or the presence of Keir beside her, but something about the moment felt different. They had been traveling for hours, and Evelyn's mind was beginning to drift. She hadn't slept much the night before, and the fatigue was starting to catch up with her. She found herself staring at the trees passing by, the rhythm of the cart's movement lulling her into a daze. "You're quiet," Keir's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She blinked, looking over at him. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable as always. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice soft. "About what?" he asked, his tone curious but still guarded. Evelyn hesitated. There was so much she wanted to say, so many questions she needed answers to, but the words felt stuck inside her. She didn't know how to voice the confusion that had settled in her chest. "About everything," she finally said. "About why I'm here. About what happens next." Keir's eyes softened, just for a moment, and then he turned his attention back to the road. "The journey ahead is not easy," he said quietly. "But it is the only way." Evelyn nodded slowly, unsure of what to make of his words. She could feel the weight of his statement, the unspoken promise of something more. But what that more was, she had no idea. The cart creaked again as it continued down the road, the sound blending with the rustling of leaves in the wind. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The landscape shifted once more, the trees thinning out completely, to reveal a wide, open plain. In the distance, Evelyn could see the outline of a stone structure, massive, imposing, and ancient. Her heart skipped a beat. Thornville. It was just as she had imagined, a place both beautiful and daunting, a world that felt both old and alive. The cart began to slow as they approached the gates, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. This was it. She was finally here. As the cart passed through the gates, she couldn't help but feel a rush of mixed emotions: excitement, fear, anticipation. She had no idea what awaited her inside, but she knew one thing for certain: this was the start of something new. Keir didn't speak as the cart came to a stop in front of a large, ornate building. He helped her down from the cart, his touch steady but firm. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. Evelyn nodded, her heart racing. She had no choice but to follow him. There was no turning back now. They entered the building, and the air inside was thick with history. The walls were lined with tapestries, and the floors beneath their feet were smooth stone, worn from years of use. Evelyn felt a sense of awe wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by the same unease that had followed her throughout the journey. Keir led her down a long hallway, his steps steady and sure. As they walked, she noticed the subtle glances from the people they passed. It was clear they were aware of her presence, and the way they looked at her made her feel like an outsider. She was just one of many, and yet, for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. They reached a set of double doors, and Keir paused before them. This is where it begins, he said softly. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as he pushed the doors open, revealing a grand chamber filled with people. They were all seated, their eyes fixed on the center of the room where a large throne sat. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Evelyn could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but it was nothing like she had imagined. Keir stepped forward, and the room fell silent. Evelyn stayed close behind him, unsure of what to do next. She had never felt so out of place in her life. The grand chamber was filled with the sound of soft murmurs, but as the heavy doors swung open, everything fell silent. Evelyn could feel the weight of the room's attention on her, the cold eyes of the many people in the room following her every step. She moved closer to Keir, who was already making his way toward the center, his presence commanding the room. The air was thick with tension, and Evelyn's heart beat faster with each step she took. The throne at the far end of the room loomed over them, dark and imposing, as if it were waiting for someone to claim it. As they reached the center, a man rose from his seat near the throne. He was tall, his posture regal, his eyes piercing as he locked onto Evelyn. She froze for a moment, the weight of his gaze almost too much to bear. The man's presence was overwhelming, even from a distance. His features were sharp, his hair dark and flowing, his expression unreadable. There was something about him that made the room feel colder, more oppressive. "So, this is her," the man said, his voice deep and calm, but there was an edge to it. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories about the Alpha King, but seeing him in person was different. His gaze never left her, as if he were measuring her, judging her worth. Keir stepped forward slightly, as if to shield her, but the Alpha King's eyes never wavered. "She's the one," the Alpha King asked again, his voice now tinged with something colder. Keir nodded. "Yes, my lord," he replied, his tone respectful, but there was something else in his voice that Evelyn couldn't quite place. The Alpha King tilted his head slightly, studying Evelyn. "Interesting," he muttered, almost to himself. Evelyn stood still, her hands clenched at her sides, feeling both out of place and strangely drawn to the power emanating from the Alpha King. She had no idea what was happening, but she could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something important unfolding around her. The Alpha King's gaze softened slightly, though it was still intense. "You've brought her here," he said, this time addressing Keir directly. "But what exactly is she to me?" Keir stepped back slightly, but his voice remained steady. "She is your mate, my lord. The one destined for you." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat at the words. Mate. The word echoed in her mind, but she didn't understand. She had never believed in the idea of a mate, at least not for someone like her. She had always been the outsider, the one who didn't belong. But now, here she was, standing before the Alpha King, a man who seemed both untouchable and yet, somehow, familiar. The Alpha King's eyes flicked back to Evelyn, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something in them, something soft, almost vulnerable. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze that had first met her. "She is the one who will join me," the Alpha King said, more to the room than to anyone specifically. "She will become the mate of the Alpha King, and the future of this kingdom will rest upon that union." The words felt heavy, as if they were sealing her fate, but Evelyn couldn't bring herself to speak. What could she say? She had been thrust into this world she didn't understand, with no choice but to follow wherever it led. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her reaction, but all Evelyn could do was stare at the Alpha King. His presence filled the room, commanding, powerful, and frightening all at once. The air around them seemed to pulse with energy, and Evelyn felt a strange connection to it. It was as though everything around her had shifted, and in that moment, she realized that this was no ordinary meeting. This was a turning point, one that would change the course of her life forever. The Alpha King took a step closer, and Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. "You are to be my mate," he said again, his voice now quieter, though no less commanding. "But understand this: our bond will not be like any other. It will be forged in power, in blood, and in the weight of the kingdom's future." Evelyn swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what was happening, or what she had just agreed to, but she could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had never wanted this, had never wanted to be anyone's mate, let alone the mate of a man like him. But now, it seemed, there was no turning back. She had been chosen, whether she was ready or not. "Do you accept?" the Alpha King asked, his voice low and expectant. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind spinning. What choice did she have? This was her fate, tied to this man in this kingdom in ways she couldn't understand. She glanced at Keir, who stood to the side, his expression unreadable, and then back to the Alpha King. The room waited in silence, every eye on her, every breath held. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice trembling but determined. "I accept," she said, the words feeling like a weight on her tongue. The Alpha King's eyes softened for a brief moment, a flicker of something almost human crossing his face. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the coldness that had defined him. "It is done," he said. And in that moment, Evelyn knew her life had just been irrevocably changed. The weight of the Alpha King's words still lingered in the air as Evelyn stood there, frozen in the center of the room. The tension that had filled the chamber moments before had dissipated, leaving only a heavy silence. She had agreed. She had accepted the bond that tied her future to a man she barely knew, a king whose presence was both daunting and commanding. The people in the room seemed to exhale collectively, as if they had been holding their breath waiting for her response. The Alpha King turned his back on her then, his figure imposing as he made his way to the throne at the far end of the room. She watched him move, his every step deliberate, his posture straight and unyielding. It was clear now that this was his domain, his world, and she was only a small part of it. The sound of his boots against the stone floor was the only noise in the room. Evelyn felt like an outsider, like a puzzle piece forced into a place it was never meant to fit. She stood there, unable to move, her mind still reeling from the gravity of what she had just agreed to. The room remained quiet, everyone watching her with a mix of curiosity and expectation. It was as if they were waiting for her to prove herself, to show that she was worthy of the title she had just been given. But Evelyn wasn't sure she was worthy. How could she be? She had never been anything more than a forgotten Omega, dismissed by everyone around her, her worth measured by things she had no control over. She had no powers like the others, no scent that could call to a mate. What did that make her now? The mate of the Alpha King? The weight of that title felt suffocating. She didn't understand why he had chosen her. The answer eluded her, and the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. She didn't have time to dwell on her thoughts for long, though, because the Alpha King's voice broke through the stillness. "Follow me," he commanded, his tone final. She nodded instinctively, her legs moving before her mind could catch up with his words. She followed him as he walked up the steps to the throne. The guards that had stood on either side of the room stepped aside as he passed, bowing their heads slightly in respect. Evelyn stayed close behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. As they reached the throne, the Alpha King turned to face her, his gaze piercing. "You are to stay by my side," he said, his voice low but firm. "You will be my Luna. And as such, you will learn the ways of this kingdom." His eyes softened for a brief moment, but it was gone before Evelyn could fully process it. "But you must understand, Evelyn," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "This kingdom is built on strength, on power. You will be tested." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and Evelyn could feel the weight of them pressing down on her. She was already beginning to feel the intensity of the situation, the gravity of her new role. "I will do whatever is necessary," she said quietly, though the words didn't feel like they belonged to her. They felt like something she had been forced to say, a response to the pressure mounting around her. The Alpha King nodded, and for a moment, there was a strange silence between them. Evelyn stood there, unsure of what to do next. But before she could say anything else, the Alpha King turned to address the room. "This is your Luna," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "She will be by my side. Treat her with the respect she deserves." The room, which had been still moments before, erupted into whispers. Evelyn could hear the low murmurs, the hushed tones of surprise and disbelief. She felt the weight of their stares, but she didn't dare look back at them. She kept her gaze fixed on the Alpha King, unsure of what to do or how to react. He had just claimed her, in front of everyone, as his Luna. But what did that even mean? She didn't know how to be the Luna of a kingdom, how to stand beside a man like him. As the Alpha King settled into his throne, his gaze never leaving her, Evelyn felt the eyes of the entire room on her. She was no longer invisible, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like she was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, and she had no idea if she was ready to face it. The Alpha King looked at her one last time, and this time, there was a flicker of something softer in his gaze. "We will speak more later," he said, and with that, he turned his attention to the people gathered in the room. Evelyn remained standing there, her heart still racing, her mind spinning. She had been chosen, but she had no idea what this new life would hold. All she knew was that the moment she had accepted his claim, her life had changed forever. The chamber remained still after the Alpha King made his declaration, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Evelyn stood by his side, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on her. It was as if every step she had taken had led her to this moment, and now there was no turning back. She was his Luna. The realization hit her harder than she expected. The title was a heavy mantle to wear, and it felt more like a burden than a privilege. The whispers in the room grew louder, but Evelyn kept her gaze straight ahead, avoiding the stares and judgment. The Alpha King remained seated on his throne, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he watched her that made her uneasy. It was not an expression of affection or admiration. It was more like the gaze of a ruler examining something he had just claimed, something he now controlled. Evelyn took a breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had no idea what was expected of her, no idea how to behave as the Luna of this kingdom. All she had known before was the life of an outsider, never truly fitting in, never truly belonging. And now, here she was, thrust into the heart of a kingdom she didn't understand, standing beside a king whose intentions she couldn't fully grasp. She wanted to speak, to ask him what it all meant, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? How could she question the man who had just made her his mate in front of everyone? The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension, but Evelyn held her ground. She had no choice but to follow where this path led. After a long moment, the Alpha King's voice broke the silence. "You will accompany me," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "There are matters to attend to." Evelyn nodded, unsure of what else to do. She moved to follow him as he rose from his throne, his presence commanding the room once again. The people parted as he walked, his path clear, and she found herself stepping in time with him, though her mind was still racing with questions. As they exited the chamber, Evelyn couldn't help but notice how the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them, the stone walls adorned with tapestries and candles that flickered in the low light. The atmosphere was so different from what she had known, a world of power and ancient traditions that felt foreign to her. The Alpha King led her down the long hallways, his pace steady and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Evelyn, however, couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away from her. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking toward something inevitable. "What is it you expect from me?" she asked finally, her voice breaking the silence between them. The Alpha King glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Expect," he repeated, as if the question itself were strange. "I expect you to be my Luna. Nothing more." Evelyn furrowed her brow, trying to understand. "Is that all? Just to be your Luna?" The Alpha King's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something passing through them, but his expression quickly returned to its usual calm. "Your role is to stand by me, to be a part of this kingdom. You will learn what it means in time." He spoke with such authority that Evelyn had no choice but to accept his words, though doubt still gnawed at her. They continued walking in silence until they reached a set of large wooden doors, guarded by two men who stepped aside as the Alpha King approached. The doors creaked open slowly, revealing a room that was both majestic and intimidating. It was filled with maps, books, and documents, and at the far end stood a large desk, where several people were gathered, speaking in hushed tones. The atmosphere in the room was serious, the air heavy with the weight of responsibility. The Alpha King walked to the desk without a word, his presence immediately commanding the attention of those present. As he passed, the others bowed their heads in respect, and Evelyn followed him inside, her heart still pounding in her chest. She stood by his side, unsure of what was expected of her in this new world she had entered. She had never been a part of something this grand, this important. The Alpha King turned to face her, his gaze now softer, though still intense. "You will learn to navigate this world, Evelyn. But for now, I need you to be patient." His words were almost gentle, and for a moment, Evelyn wondered if there was more to him than she had realized. She had only seen the cold, commanding side of him until now. Could there be another side? She didn't know, but she would have to wait to find out. As the room continued with its discussions, Evelyn remained silent, her thoughts racing. The uncertainty of her position weighed on her, but she knew there was no turning back now. The Alpha King had chosen her, and now, her life was tied to his in a way she didn't yet fully understand. She only hoped that, in time, she would find her place in this new world. The room fell into a steady rhythm, the discussions around the desk continuing with the quiet intensity of important matters being decided. Evelyn stood at the side, feeling almost invisible amidst the flow of business and conversation. She had expected more attention, more curiosity from the others in the room, but it seemed they were all focused on the Alpha King and the decisions he made. No one glanced at her, no one acknowledged her presence. And for a moment, she found herself almost grateful for that. She had never been good at being the center of attention, and in this strange new world, where every step felt like an impossible journey, it was a relief to fade into the background. Still, the unease never fully left her. The silence between her and the Alpha King spoke volumes, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of the expectations pressing down on her. What was her role in all of this? What had she agreed to? The Alpha King's eyes flicked briefly to her, his gaze sharp but unreadable, before he turned his attention back to the papers in front of him. Evelyn watched him, trying to make sense of the man who had chosen her as his mate, his Luna. She had seen the cold authority in him, the undeniable power that surrounded him. But there was more to him, she was sure of it. She had felt it, that fleeting softness in his gaze, the momentary vulnerability that had crossed his face when he looked at her. It was a side of him she had not expected, and it left her with more questions than answers. But there was no time for questions now. As the meeting continued, the room grew darker, the shadows stretching longer across the floor. The discussions became more complex, and Evelyn could feel her mind beginning to drift. She wasn't used to this world, to the politics and strategies of a kingdom. She was used to being ignored, pushed aside, a mere shadow in the background. But here, she was expected to stand beside the Alpha King, to play a role she didn't understand. And that scared her more than anything. The room's atmosphere shifted as a new figure entered, his footsteps heavy, his presence unmistakable. The Alpha King barely acknowledged him, but Evelyn could feel the change, the tension that rippled through the room at his arrival. The man was tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his eyes cold and calculating. He scanned the room quickly before his gaze landed on Evelyn. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips, and Evelyn instinctively took a step back. The Alpha King didn't look up from his papers, but the air around him seemed to change, as if a storm were brewing. The man who had entered was someone important, someone who held power, but Evelyn didn't know who he was. "Ah, so this is the Luna," the man's voice was smooth, almost mocking, as he looked her over with obvious interest. Evelyn's stomach tightened, and she forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show any sign of weakness. The Alpha King's gaze flicked briefly to the man before returning to the papers in front of him. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is Evelyn." There was something in the way the Alpha King spoke, a quiet authority that made the room fall silent once more. The man, still eyeing Evelyn, nodded slowly, but there was something unsettling in his smile. "Interesting," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure she'll be a wonderful addition." His words hung in the air, heavy with an implication that made Evelyn's skin crawl. She felt exposed under his gaze, but she held her ground, refusing to show any sign of fear. The Alpha King's eyes darkened as he finally looked up, meeting the man's gaze for the first time. "Leave her be," the Alpha King said, his voice carrying the weight of a command. The man's smile faltered, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gave a small bow and turned to leave the room, his presence still lingering in the air long after he had gone. The room returned to its previous tension, but Evelyn's mind was still racing. Who was that man? And why did his words feel so threatening? She couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here, something she didn't fully understand. The Alpha King returned to his seat, but this time, his attention was solely on her. He didn't speak for a long while, but Evelyn could feel the weight of his gaze, as if he were waiting for her to say something. She wasn't sure what he expected, but she wasn't ready to speak yet. There were too many questions in her mind, and no answers in sight. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until finally, the Alpha King spoke. "You must understand, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and steady. "This kingdom, my kingdom, is built on power. And in this world, power is everything. You will need to learn how to navigate it, how to stand by my side and support me. But you must also understand that it will not be easy." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. He was giving her a glimpse into the world she had entered, a world of power and control. But what did he expect from her? What role would she play in this kingdom? The question swirled in her mind, but all she could do was nod, unsure of how to respond. "I understand," she said softly, though the words didn't feel like they belonged to her. She wasn't sure if she truly understood, but it was the only thing she could say. The Alpha King watched her for a moment longer before turning his attention back to the papers in front of him. "We will continue this later," he said, his voice final. And with that, the meeting continued, leaving Evelyn to wonder what her future would hold in this strange new world.